The black Lamborghini roared to a stop outside the small diner, its engine cutting through the quiet evening air like a knife. Steam rose from the hood as the driver sat inside for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles had turned white. Today had been one of those days that could make or break a man's empire, and for billionaire tech mogul Richard Stone, it had definitely been the breaking kind. His phone buzzed again with another message from his assistant. The merger he'd been working on for 8 months had just fallen through. $3 billion down the drain because some old-fashioned board members thought his company was too aggressive in its business practices. The word still burned in his mind. Aggressive. As if being aggressive was a bad thing in the business world. As if playing nice ever got anyone to the top of the food chain. Richard stepped out of his car, his $1,000 Italian leather shoes hitting the cracked pavement of the parking lot. He looked around with disgust. This wasn't supposed to be his evening. He was supposed to be dining at Le Bernardin, celebrating the biggest deal of his career with champagne that cost more than most people made in a month. Instead, his reservation had been canceled when the merger fell through, and his assistant couldn't get him a table anywhere else decent on such short notice. The diner in front of him looked like something out of a movie from the 1950s. The neon sign flickered weakly, spelling out Lily's Family Diner in faded red letters. Paint peeled from the building's exterior, and the windows were fogged with steam from the kitchen inside. Through the glass, he could see families crowded around small tables, children laughing, and elderly couples sharing pieces of pie. It made his stomach turn. Richard had grown up in places like this. His father had owned a small restaurant chain before Richard made his first billion and convinced him to sell everything and retire. Back then, Richard thought he was helping his father escape the working-class life. Now, standing outside this run-down establishment, he wondered why he was even bothering to go inside. But hunger won over pride, and Richard pushed through the front door. A small bell chimed above his head, causing several customers to look up from their meals. He immediately felt their eyes on him, taking in his expensive suit, his gold watch, and his general air of importance. These people probably hadn't seen someone like him in their entire lives. The interior was even worse than he'd imagined. The floors were worn linoleum, cracked in several places, and held together with duct tape. The booths were covered in red, vinyl that had seen better days, with some seats patched up with more tape. Country music played softly from an old radio behind the counter, mixing with the sounds of sizzling from the open kitchen and the chatter of customers. A middle-aged woman with graying hair and a tired smile approached him from behind the counter. She was wearing a simple uniform with a name tag that read Betty, and had the look of someone who'd been working in restaurants her entire life. "Good evening, hun," she said warmly. "Just yourself tonight?" Richard barely looked at her. "Obviously," he replied coldly. "Though I have to say, this place wasn't exactly my first choice, or my second, or my 10th for that matter." Betty's smile faltered slightly, but she maintained her professional demeanor. "Well, we'll do our best to make sure you have a nice meal. Right this way." She led him to a booth near the window, the same type of booth he'd sat in countless times, as a child when his family couldn't afford anything better. The irony wasn't lost on him, but instead of feeling nostalgic, he felt annoyed. He'd worked too hard and come too far to end up back in a place like this. As he slid into the booth, Richard noticed the other customers stealing glances at him. A family with 3 young children occupied the booth next to him, the parents trying to keep their kids from staring while they whispered among themselves. Across the room, a group of construction workers still covered in dust from their day's work were sharing a large pizza and laughing loudly at something one of them had said. In the corner, an elderly couple sat holding hands across their small table, sharing what looked like a piece of apple pie. The man was wearing a veteran's cap, and the woman had a small cross necklace that caught the light from the fluorescent bulbs overhead. They looked content, happy even, in this place that Richard considered beneath him. Betty returned with a menu and a glass of water. "Our special tonight is meatloaf with mashed potatoes and green beans," she said. "It's really popular with our regulars. Can I start you off with something to drink?" Richard looked at the menu with disgust. Everything was so simple, so ordinary. Burgers, fries, meatloaf, chicken, and dumplings. Where were the truffle oils, the grass-fed beef, the organic, locally sourced vegetables? This was exactly the kind of food he'd spent his entire adult life trying to get away from. "Do you have anything that wasn't frozen and reheated?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Anything that doesn't come from a can or a box?" Betty's face flushed slightly. "Sir, we make everything fresh here. Our cook has been with us for 15 years and we use local suppliers whenever possible." "Local suppliers," Richard repeated mockingly. "I'm sure they're top quality. What's your most expensive item?" Betty pointed to the menu. "That would be our ribeye steak dinner. It comes with a baked potato and salad for $24.95. Richard almost laughed out loud. $25 for what was probably the most expensive meal they served. He'd spent more than that on a single glass of wine at lunch. But at this point, he just wanted to eat something and get out of this place as quickly as possible. "Fine," he said dismissively. "I'll take the steak, and make sure it's cooked properly. I don't want it burnt or raw. And I'll need the salad. Dressing on the side. Actually, do you even have any decent dressing, or is everything here from a bottle?" Betty took a deep breath before answering. "We make our ranch and Italian dressings fresh daily, and we also have balsamic vinaigrette." "I suppose the balsamic will have to do," Richard said, handing her the menu without making eye contact. "And bring me a coffee, black, and make sure the cup is clean." As Betty walked away, Richard pulled out his phone and began scrolling through emails, trying to ignore the stares from other customers. His phone buzzed with notifications from news outlets covering the failed merger. The headlines made his blood boil. "Stone Industries merger falls through," read one. "Aggressive tactics backfire for tech billionaire," read another. He was so focused on his phone that he didn't notice when a young woman approached his table with a coffee pot in hand. She moved quietly, professionally, clearly experienced at navigating around tables without disturbing customers. But when she reached his booth, Richard looked up with irritation. "I asked for coffee 5 minutes ago," he snapped, even though it had only been 2 minutes since Betty had taken his order. "Is this the kind of service I should expect here?" The young waitress, who couldn't have been more than 30, looked surprised by his hostile tone. She had kind eyes and a gentle smile, the type of person who probably went out of her way to help others. She was wearing the same simple uniform as Betty, but hers had a name tag that read, Jessica. "I'm sorry, sir," she said politely, filling his cup with steaming coffee. "I'll make sure your order is prioritized. Is there anything else I can get for you while you wait?" Richard studied her face, looking for any sign of judgment or attitude. But all he saw was genuine politeness and a desire to do her job well. Somehow this made him even angrier. He didn't want her pity or her fake kindness. He wanted someone to fight back, to give him a reason to unleash all the frustration and anger that had been building up inside him all day. "Yeah," he said slowly, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "You can explain to me why a place like this is even still in business? Don't people have standards anymore?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Richard could feel the attention of nearby customers, shifting toward their conversation. The family with 3 children had stopped talking, and even the construction workers had lowered their voices. Everyone seemed to sense that something unpleasant was about to happen. Jessica's smile wavered, but she maintained her composure. "We've been serving this community for over 30 years, sir. Our customers are like family to us." "Family," Richard repeated, shaking his head. "How touching. Well, since we're family now, maybe you can tell me why the parking lot looks like a war zone and why everything in here smells like grease and desperation." The words cut through the diner like a blade, and Richard felt a dark satisfaction as he watched Jessica's face flush with embarrassment. Finally, he was getting the reaction he wanted. Finally, someone else was going to feel as small and powerless as he'd felt in that boardroom today. But as he looked around the diner, he realized that his words hadn't just hurt Jessica. The elderly couple in the corner had stopped eating their pie and were staring at him with disappointment. The family next to him was gathering their things, preparing to leave. Even the construction workers looked uncomfortable, their laughter replaced by an awkward silence. Richard didn't care. Let them all be uncomfortable. Let them all feel what it was like to be reminded of their place in the world. He had money, power, and influence, and if he couldn't use it in a boardroom today, Then he'd use it here in this. Jessica stood frozen for a moment, the coffee pot still in her hand as Richard's harsh words echoed through the suddenly quiet diner. She could feel every pair of eyes in the room watching her, waiting to see how she would respond to this man's cruelty. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she forced herself to take a deep breath and maintain her professional smile. "I understand you're frustrated, sir," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "Let me check on your steak order and make sure everything is prepared exactly how you like it." But Richard wasn't done. The failed merger, the humiliation he'd felt in that boardroom, the sense that his entire empire was built on quicksand, it all came rushing back. And here was someone he could finally take it out on, someone who couldn't fight back, someone who had to stand there and take whatever he dished out. "Frustrated?" he said, his voice getting louder. "Lady, you have no idea what frustrated looks like. I've had meetings today worth more money than this entire neighborhood will see in a lifetime. And now I'm stuck in this dump, being served by someone who probably never made it past high school." The family at the next table quickly gathered their things and left, the parents ushering their children toward the door while shooting disapproving looks at Richard. He barely noticed them go. His attention was completely focused on Jessica, who was still standing by his table, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to abandon her post. "Sir, I really think," Jessica began, but Richard cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "I don't care what you think," he snapped. "You're a waitress in a greasy spoon diner. Your thoughts aren't exactly in high demand." Behind the counter, Betty watched the scene unfold with growing concern. She'd been working in restaurants for over 20 years and had dealt with difficult customers before. But there was something particularly cruel about this man's behavior. She caught Jessica's eye and gave her an encouraging nod, silently telling her to hang in there. The elderly couple in the corner, Harold and Mary, who had been coming to Lily's diner every Friday night for the past 8 years, whispered to each other in shocked tones. Harold, a retired factory worker who had served in Vietnam, shook his head in disgust. He'd seen plenty of bullies in his time, but watching a grown man attack a young woman just trying to do her job made his blood boil. "Some people got no class," Harold muttered to his wife, loud enough for others to hear. "Money can't buy you decency, that's for sure." Richard heard the comment and turned his cold stare toward the old man. "Excuse me," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Did you have something to say?" Harold started to stand up, but Mary gently placed her hand on his arm, silently pleading with him not to escalate the situation. They had seen too much conflict in their lives, and at their age they just wanted to enjoy their pie in peace. Richard smirked at Harold's silence and turned back to Jessica. "See? Even your customers know better than to get involved. They understand the natural order of things." Jessica's hands were shaking now, but she refused to let this man see her break down. She had been working double shifts for months, saving every penny she could while studying for her nursing degree. This job wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and she took pride in treating every customer with respect and kindness. She didn't deserve this treatment, and deep down, she knew it. "Your steak should be ready in just a few more minutes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is there anything else I can get for you while you wait?" Richard leaned back in his booth and studied her with the same cold calculation he used when evaluating a company he was thinking about buying and dismantling. "You know what you can get me," he said slowly. "You can explain to me how someone like you ends up in a place like this. What went wrong in your life that this is the best you could do?" The construction workers at their table had stopped eating entirely. One of them, a burly man named Tony who had 3 daughters of his own, clenched his fists under the table. He'd worked hard his entire life to provide for his family, and seeing this rich man tear down someone who was clearly just trying to make an honest living made him sick to his stomach. "Hey, buddy," Tony called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to managing work crews. "Why don't you leave the girl alone and just eat your food?" Richard's eyes lit up with malicious glee. Finally, someone was willing to engage with him. "Oh, I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with sarcasm. "Are you the manager here? Because last I checked, I was the customer, and the customer is always right." "The customer ain't always right when he's being a jerk," Tony shot back, half rising. From his seat. A jerk? Richard laughed, but there was no humor in it. Sir, I probably pay more in taxes in a single month than you make in an entire year. I think that gives me the right to expect decent service. Money don't give you the right to treat people like garbage, Tony replied, his voice steady but angry. Richard stood up from his booth, his expensive suit making him look completely out of place among the working-class customers of the diner. You want to know something about money? He said, addressing not just Tony but the entire room. Money is the only thing that matters in this world. It's the only thing that separates the winners from the losers. And looking around this room, I can tell which category most of you fall into. Betty had heard enough. She came out from behind the counter, her years of experience in dealing with difficult situations evident in her calm but firm demeanor. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice and treat my staff with respect, or I'll have to ask you to leave. Richard turned his attention to Betty, sizing her up like a predator evaluating prey. You're going to ask me to leave? He said incredulously. Do you have any idea who I am? I could buy this entire building and have it torn down before the end of the week. I could have this place shut down with a single phone call. I don't care if you're the president, Betty replied firmly. Nobody talks to my girls like that. Not in my diner. The standoff lasted for several tense seconds with the entire restaurant holding its breath. Even the cook had stopped working and was watching from the kitchen window, a large spatula still in his hand as if he might need to use it for something other than cooking. Jessica, meanwhile, was fighting back tears. She had dealt with rude customers before, but nothing like this. This man seemed to take genuine pleasure in making her feel small and worthless. She thought about her younger brother at home, struggling with his medical bills, and how much this job meant to their family's survival. She couldn't afford to lose it no matter how badly this customer treated her. Please, she said quietly, stepping between Betty and Richard. It's okay. I can handle this. Sir, let me just get your steak for you. I'm sure it's ready by now. She hurried toward the kitchen, grateful for any excuse to get away from Richard's cruel stare. But as she walked, she could hear him continuing his rant behind her. That's what I thought, he called after her. Some people know their place in this world. When Jessica returned with his plate, her hands were still trembling slightly. The steak looked perfectly cooked, and she had arranged everything just the way the kitchen always did. But as she set it down in front of Richard, she accidentally brushed against his water glass with her elbow. The glass tipped over, sending water spilling across the table and onto Richard's expensive pants. It wasn't much water, maybe half a glass, but it was enough to send Richard into a rage that shocked even the customers who had been watching his behavior escalate all evening. Are you kidding me? He roared, jumping to his feet so quickly that his chair scraped loudly against the floor. Are you completely incompetent? These pants cost more than you make in a month. Jessica immediately grabbed napkins and began trying to clean up the spill, apologizing repeatedly. I'm so sorry, sir. I'm so sorry. It was an accident. Let me clean this up for you. But Richard was beyond reason now. All the anger and frustration and humiliation he'd felt throughout the day came pouring out in a torrent of cruel words that would haunt Jessica for weeks to come. Get away from me, he snarled, pushing her hands away from the table. You're worthless. Absolutely worthless. This is exactly why people like you end up in places like this. You can't do anything right. You're a failure at the most basic level of human competence. The diner had gone completely silent now. Even the radio seemed to have stopped playing, leaving only the sound of Richard's voice echoing off the walls. Jessica stood there, napkins still in her hands, tears finally beginning to flow down her cheeks despite her best efforts to hold them back. I bet this is the highlight of your pathetic little life, Richard continued, his voice getting louder with each word. Serving people who are actually successful, actually important. Well, let me tell you something. You will never be anything more than this. You will spend your entire life cleaning up other people's messes because that's all you're good for. And that's when he noticed it. Something on Jessica's wrist that would change everything. Richard was still standing, his face red with anger, when something caught his eye that made his breath catch in his throat. As Jessica reached across the table to soak up the spilled water, Her sleeve pulled back slightly, revealing something on her wrist that he hadn't noticed before. At first, he thought it was just a bracelet or maybe a tattoo, but as his eyes focused on it, his blood ran cold. There, etched delicately into what looked like a small silver charm, was a symbol he knew better than his own signature. It was a tree with deep roots and spreading branches surrounded by the words, "Knowledge grows here," in tiny script. The logo of the Stone Foundation for Educational Excellence, the charity his father had started 35 years ago, long before Richard had become wealthy, long before he had forgotten what it meant to struggle. Richard's mouth went dry. His legs felt weak. The angry words that had been flowing so easily just moments before suddenly stuck in his throat like concrete. He stared at Jessica's wrist, hoping he was wrong, hoping his eyes were playing tricks on him. But there was no mistaking that symbol. He had seen it on thousands of documents, scholarship letters, and foundation materials over the years. "Where did you get that?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Jessica looked up from cleaning the table, confused by the sudden change in his tone. "Get what, sir?" That thing on your wrist," Richard said, pointing with a shaking finger. "Where did you get it?" Jessica glanced down at her charm bracelet, touching the small silver piece gently. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, she smiled, a real, genuine smile that lit up her entire face. "Oh, this?" she said softly. "This is from the Stone Foundation. I got it when I received my scholarship 5 years ago. It's been my good luck charm ever since." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He actually took a step backward, bumping into his chair and nearly falling down. The entire diner was still watching, but now they were watching something completely different. Instead of an angry billionaire berating a helpless waitress, they were seeing a man who looked like he'd just seen a ghost. "The Stone Foundation," Richard repeated slowly, as if saying the words might make them less real. "Yes, sir," Jessica said, her voice taking on a tone of genuine gratitude that made Richard's stomach twist with shame. "It's the most wonderful organization. They gave me a full scholarship to nursing school plus money for books and living expenses. Without them, I never would have been able to afford college. My family, we didn't have much growing up, and this scholarship literally changed my life." Richard felt like he was going to be sick. He sank back down into his booth, his expensive suit suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Around him, the other customers were beginning to murmur among themselves, sensing that something significant was happening but not understanding what. Betty, who had been watching from behind the counter, noticed the dramatic change in Richard's demeanor and slowly approached the table. "Is everything all right?" she asked carefully. Richard couldn't answer. His mind was racing back through the years, remembering conversations with his father that he had dismissed as old-fashioned sentimentality. His father, Robert Stone, had started the foundation after growing up poor himself, working his way through college as a janitor and short-order cook. He had always said that education was the great equalizer, the one thing that could lift someone out of poverty and give them a real chance at success. "Every scholarship we give," his father used to say, "is an investment in someone's dreams. These kids work twice as hard as anyone else because they know what it means to have nothing. They appreciate every opportunity because they know how rare opportunities can be." Richard had inherited control of the foundation when his father passed away 3 years ago, but he had always left the day-to-day operations to his staff. He signed the checks and attended the occasional fundraising dinner, but he had never really connected with the mission. To him, it was just another tax write-off, another way to improve his public image. He had never thought about the actual people receiving the scholarships. He had never imagined that one of them might be standing in front of him, serving him coffee in a small-town diner. "Tell me about your scholarship," he said quietly, his voice completely different from the cruel tone he had been using just minutes before. Jessica looked surprised by his interest, but she was clearly happy to talk about something that meant so much to her. "Well, I applied during my senior year of high school," she began. "My guidance counselor told me about it. I never thought I had a chance. My grades were good, but there were so many other applicants who seemed more qualified." She paused to finish cleaning up the water spill, her movements careful and precise. Richard noticed that her hands had stopped shaking. "But I wrote an essay about wanting to be a nurse," she continued. "About how my little brother Danny has cerebral palsy, and watching the nurses at the hospital take care of him made me realize that was what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to help people the way they helped my family." Richard's throat tightened. He remembered the essay section of the scholarship application. His father had insisted on it, saying that grades and test scores could only tell you so much about a person. The essays were where applicants could show their heart, their motivation, their dreams. "The scholarship covers my tuition completely," Jessica went on, her voice filled with wonder even after all these years. "Plus, I get money for books and supplies. And they even have a support program where scholarship recipients can call if they're having trouble with their classes or just need someone to talk to. The foundation doesn't just give you money and forget about you. They really care about your success." With each word Jessica spoke, Richard felt smaller and more ashamed. This young woman, who he had just finished calling worthless and incompetent, was exactly the kind of person his father had dreamed of helping. She was working multiple jobs to support her family while pursuing an education that would allow her to help others. She was everything the foundation stood for, everything his father had believed in. "The best part," Jessica continued, not noticing Richard's pale complexion and shaking hands, "is the letter that comes with the scholarship. It's personally signed by Mr. Stone himself, the founder's son. He writes about how education can change not just your life, but the lives of everyone around you. About how knowledge is something no one can ever take away from you." Richard closed his eyes. He knew those letters. He had been signing them for 3 years ever since taking over the foundation. But he had never read them carefully, never thought about the impact they might have on the recipients. To him they were just another administrative task, something his assistant drafted and he signed without thinking. "I keep that letter in my room at home," Jessica said softly. "Sometimes when school gets really hard or I'm working a double shift and feeling exhausted, I read it again. It reminds me that someone out there believes in me, even when I don't believe in myself." The construction worker named Tony, who had been listening to this conversation along with everyone else in the diner, leaned forward in his seat. "That's a hell of a story," he said quietly. "Sounds like this Stone guy really knows what he's doing." Richard wanted to laugh, but it would have been the most bitter laugh of his life. If only Tony knew that the Stone guy he was praising was the same man who had just spent the last 20 minutes tearing down everything the foundation represented. "He does," Jessica agreed, touching the charm on her wrist again. "The foundation has this motto, 'Lifting others lifts ourselves.' I think about that a lot. Every time I help a customer here at the diner, every time I study for an exam, every time I visit Danny at his therapy sessions, I remember that I'm not just improving my own life. I'm becoming someone who can make other people's lives better, too." Richard felt tears stinging his eyes. "Lifting others lifts ourselves." Those had been his father's words, carved into the stone plaque in the foundation's lobby. Words that Richard had walked past thousands of times without really seeing them, without understanding what they meant. Harold, the elderly veteran in the corner, had been listening too. He stood up slowly and walked over to Jessica, his wife, Mary following behind him. "Young lady," he said gently, "that's a beautiful story. Your parents must be very proud of you." Jessica's smile wavered slightly. "Thank you, sir. My parents passed away in a car accident when I was 18. That's part of why the scholarship meant so much to me. Without it, I would have had to give up on college and work full-time to take care of Danny." The words hit Richard like another punch to the gut. This young woman had lost her parents, was taking care of a disabled brother, working multiple jobs, going to school, and still managing to maintain her kindness and dignity in the face of his cruelty. She was living proof of everything his father had believed about the power of education and the strength of the human spirit. Richard looked around the diner at all the faces staring at him. Betty, with her years of experience reading people and situations. Tony and his fellow workers, honest men who knew the value of hard work. Harold and Mary, who had probably seen enough cruelty in their long lives. And Jessica, still standing by his table, still trying to do her job despite everything he had put her through. They were all waiting to see what he would do next. But Richard himself had no idea. For the first time in years, the man who always had a plan, who always knew exactly what to say and do to get what he wanted, was completely lost. Richard sat in stunned silence for what felt like hours but was probably only a few seconds. The weight of what he had just learned pressed down on him like a physical force. His hands were trembling now, and he had to grip the edge of the table to steady himself. The woman standing before him, the woman he had just finished humiliating in front of an entire restaurant, was one of his own scholarship recipients. "I need to know more," he said quietly, his voice so different from the cruel tone he'd been using that Jessica looked genuinely confused. "About your scholarship, about your brother, about everything." Jessica glanced at Betty, who nodded encouragingly. The older woman had seen something shift in this man's demeanor, and while she didn't understand what was happening, she sensed it was important. "Well," Jessica began hesitantly, "I don't know what else to tell you. The foundation changed my life. Before I got the scholarship, I was working 3 part-time jobs just to help pay for Danny's medical bills and keep food on the table. My guidance counselor practically had to force me to apply because I was convinced I'd never get it." Richard's mind flashed back to the foundation's selection process. He remembered his father explaining how they specifically looked for students who were working to support their families, students who understood responsibility and sacrifice. "Academic excellence is important," his father had always said, "but character is everything." "What did you write about in your essay?" Richard asked, though he was afraid to hear the answer. Jessica's face lit up again, the same genuine smile that had appeared when she first talked about the scholarship. "I wrote about Danny mostly, about how when he was born the doctors said he might never walk or talk normally. But the nurses at the children's hospital, they never gave up on him. They worked with him every day, celebrating every tiny improvement." She paused, lost in the memory. "I remember this one nurse, Mrs. Rodriguez. She used to stay after her shift ended just to help Danny with his physical therapy. She never made it seem like work. She made it seem like the most important thing in the world. That's when I knew I wanted to be like her." Richard felt his chest tighten. He could picture his father reading that essay, could imagine how moved he would have been by this young woman's dedication to her family and her dreams of helping others. "Danny's doing so much better now," Jessica continued. "He's in a special program at school, and he's even learning to use a computer. The doctors say he might be able to live independently someday, but it's expensive. The therapy, the equipment, the special programs, that's why this job is so important to me, why the scholarship means everything." Tony, who had been listening from his table, spoke up. "How old is your brother now?" "He's 14, Jessica replied. "He's the smartest kid you'd ever meet. He knows more about astronomy than most adults. He wants to be a scientist when he grows up." Harold, the elderly veteran, nodded approvingly. "Takes a special kind of person to take care of family like that. Your parents would be proud." At the mention of her parents, Jessica's expression grew sadder but also more determined. "They always taught us to take care of each other. Mom used to say that family isn't just about blood, it's about showing up for the people who need you." Each word felt like a knife in Richard's chest. Here was someone who understood family, loyalty, and sacrifice in ways he had completely forgotten. While he had been building his empire and accumulating wealth, this young woman had been living the values his father had tried to teach him. "The scholarship letter," Richard said suddenly, his voice barely audible. "You said you keep it in your room. What does it say exactly?" Jessica looked surprised by the question, but she seemed happy to share. "I know it by heart," she said softly. "It says, 'Dear Jessica, education is not just about gaining knowledge. It's about gaining the power to transform your life and the lives of those around you. Your essay shows that you understand this truth. You write not about what you want to achieve for yourself, but about how you want to serve others. This is the foundation of true success.'" Richard closed his eyes. Those words sounded familiar, but he couldn't remember writing them. His assistant probably drafted most of the letters using templates from previous years, but as Jessica continued reciting, he realized these weren't generic words. They were personal, specific to her application. Your dedication to your brother and your dream of becoming a nurse demonstrate the kind of character we hope to nurture through our scholarship program, Jessica continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. Remember that knowledge is not something to be hoarded. It's something to be shared. Every person you help as a nurse will be helped because someone believed in your potential today. The words crashed over Richard like a wave. He did remember writing that letter now. It had been late at night, 3 years ago, just a few months after his father's funeral. He had been going through scholarship applications personally for the first time, trying to honor his father's memory by taking a more active role in the foundation. Jessica's essay had moved him so deeply that he had stayed up until dawn crafting a personal response. Your father would be proud of the young woman you've become, Jessica continued, and we are honored to be part of your journey. Use this opportunity not just to build a better life for yourself, but to build a better world for everyone. Sincerely, Richard Stone, Chairman, Stone Foundation for Educational Excellence. The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in the diner was staring at Richard now, and he could see the recognition dawning on their faces. Betty's hand flew to her mouth. Tony's eyes widened in shock. Harold and Mary exchanged meaningful glances. Richard Stone. Betty whispered, "You're Richard Stone." Richard nodded slowly, unable to speak. The irony was so complete, so devastating, that he felt like he might be sick. He had personally selected Jessica for the scholarship. He had written those beautiful words about her character and potential. And then, 3 years later, he had stood in this very diner and called her worthless. Jessica was staring at him with an expression of complete bewilderment. You're Mr. Stone?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Richard managed to say. "I'm Richard Stone." The young woman who had been cleaning up his spilled water just minutes before now looked at him with a mixture of shock, confusion, and something that might have been hurt. "But you said—" "I know what I said," Richard interrupted, his voice breaking. "I know exactly what I said, and I will never forgive myself for it." Tony stood up from his table, his face red with anger. "You're the guy who wrote those letters? You're the one who talks about lifting people up and building character? And then you come in here and treat her like garbage?" Richard couldn't defend himself because Tony was absolutely right. The contradiction was so stark, so impossible to justify, that any explanation would have sounded hollow. "I don't understand," Jessica said, tears starting to form in her eyes again. "The person who wrote that letter, who believed in me, who helped me change my life, that was you? But the person who just called me worthless and said I'd never amount to anything, that was you too?" Richard looked into her eyes and saw something that hurt worse than anger or hatred. He saw disappointment. This young woman had carried his words with her for 3 years, had read them whenever she needed encouragement, had believed in the man who wrote them, and now that image was shattered forever. "Jessica," he said, her name feeling strange on his lips after everything that had happened. "I don't know how to explain what just happened here. I don't know how to explain what I've become." Harold stepped closer to the table, his weathered face showing a lifetime of experience with human nature. "Son," he said quietly, "I've seen a lot of men in my time. Good men who lost their way, bad men who found it. The question isn't who you were or who you've become. The question is who you're going to choose to be right now." Mary nodded in agreement. "That girl has been carrying your words in her heart for 3 years. She's been living up to the person you told her she could be. Maybe it's time you started living up to the person who wrote those words." Richard looked around the diner at all the faces watching him. These weren't wealthy investors or business competitors. These were real people, working people. People who understood what it meant to struggle and fight for every opportunity. People like his father had been. People like he had once been, before money and power had changed him into someone he no longer recognized. "I need to make this right," he said finally, his voice stronger than it had been all evening. "I don't know how, but I need to make this right." Richard stood up slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. The expensive suit that had made him feel so powerful when he walked into the diner now felt like a costume he no longer wanted to wear. He looked around at the faces watching him, Betty's concerned expression, Tony's angry but curious stare, Harold and Mary's weathered faces showing cautious hope, and Jessica's eyes still shining with unshed tears. "Jessica," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something, and I need everyone here to hear it." The diner was so quiet you could hear the old refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Even the cook had come out to watch, wiping his hands on his apron, as he leaned against the door frame. Richard took a deep breath, feeling like he was about to jump off a cliff. 3 years ago, when I read your scholarship essay, I cried. I actually cried sitting at my desk at 2 in the morning, reading about how you wanted to help your brother and become a nurse. You reminded me of why my father started the foundation in the first place. His voice grew stronger as he continued. My father grew up poor, really poor. He worked in restaurants like this one to pay for college. He started the foundation because he believed that everyone deserved a chance, that education could change everything. He used to tell me that money without purpose was just paper, that real wealth came from lifting others up. Jessica's hand moved unconsciously to the charm on her wrist, touching it gently as she listened. But somewhere along the way I forgot all of that, Richard continued, his voice cracking with emotion. I became obsessed with making more money, building a bigger empire, proving I was better than everyone else. I turned into exactly the kind of person my father spent his life fighting against. Tony shifted in his seat, his anger softening slightly as he watched this powerful man completely break down in front of them. Today was the worst day of my professional life. Richard went. A business deal I'd been working on for months fell apart. I felt humiliated, powerless, angry, and instead of dealing with those feelings like an adult, I came in here looking for someone to hurt the way I was hurting. Betty stepped closer, her maternal instincts kicking in despite everything she'd witnessed. We all have bad days, honey, she said gently. But what matters is what we do next. Richard nodded, tears starting to flow freely down his cheeks. Jessica, when I wrote that letter to you 3 years ago, I meant every word. You are everything the foundation stands for. You're smart, dedicated, caring, and strong. You're exactly the kind of person who can change the world. He paused, struggling to find the right words. The man who treated you so terribly tonight. That's not who I want to be. That's not who my father raised me to be. That's not the person who wrote your scholarship letter. Jessica was crying now too, but she seemed to be listening carefully to every word he said. I can't take back what I said to you, Richard continued. I can't undo the hurt I caused, but I can promise you something. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to become the man who wrote that letter again, the man my father believed I could be. Harold stood up and walked slowly toward Richard. For a moment, everyone thought the old veteran might be planning to say something harsh, but instead he placed a gentle hand on Richard's shoulder. Son, Harold said quietly, my unit in Vietnam had a saying, it ain't about how hard you fall, it's about whether you get back up. You fell pretty hard tonight. The question is, what are you going to do now? Richard looked into the old man's eyes and saw wisdom earned through decades of life experience. I want to get back up, he said firmly, but I don't know how. Mary joined her husband, her kind face showing the same compassion she'd probably shown to countless people over the years. You start by making things right with the people you've hurt, she said simply. And then you do better tomorrow than you did today. Richard turned back to Jessica, who was still standing by his table, still holding the damp napkins from cleaning up his spilled water. Jessica, I want to do more than just apologize. I want to make sure you can focus on your studies without worrying about money. I want to make sure Danny gets the best care possible. Jessica shook her head quickly. Mr. Stone, I don't want your pity. I don't want charity because you feel guilty. It's not pity, Richard said urgently. And it's not guilt. Not entirely. It's recognition. When I read your essay 3 years ago, I saw someone with the potential to change lives. Tonight, I tried to destroy that person. I need to do everything I can to help you become who you're meant to be. Not because I feel bad, but because it's right. Tony leaned forward in his seat. Talk is cheap, buddy. What exactly are you planning to do? Richard pulled out his phone, his hand still shaking slightly. I'm calling my assistant right now. Tomorrow morning we're going to set up a special fund for Jessica's education and her brother's medical needs. Not just the scholarship she already has, but everything she needs to succeed. Mr. Stone? Jessica started to protest, but he held up his hand. Let me finish, he said. I'm also going to start visiting scholarship recipients personally, not just signing checks and going to fancy fundraising dinners, but actually meeting with students, learning their stories, understanding their struggles. The foundation has become too impersonal, too distant from the people it's supposed to help. He looked around the diner at all the watching faces. And I'm going to start volunteering in places like this with people like you. My father always said that you can't understand someone's life until you've walked in their shoes. Betty smiled for the first time since the whole incident began. We could always use help here on weekends, she said. Especially someone who knows how to handle difficult customers. The comment drew a few chuckles from around the room, breaking some of the tension that had been building all evening. Richard managed a small smile. I think I could learn a lot from watching how you handle people like me. Jessica was still staring at him as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. Why should I trust you? She asked quietly. How do I know this isn't just something you're saying because you got caught? It was a fair question, and Richard knew it deserved an honest answer. You don't, he said simply. I've given you no reason to trust me. All I can do is prove it through my actions. Starting right now. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card, writing something on the back before handing it to Jessica. That's my personal cell phone number. If you ever need anything at all, you call me directly, not my assistant, not my secretary. Me. Jessica took the card hesitantly, looking at it like it might disappear. There's something else, Richard continued. The foundation has a mentorship program, but it's not very active. I want to change that. I want to pair every scholarship recipient with someone who can guide them, support them, help them navigate college and beyond. And I want to be personally involved in making sure it actually works. Harold nodded approvingly. Now you're talking, like someone who understands what leadership really means. Richard looked back at Jessica one more time. I know I can't erase what happened tonight, but I can promise you that the person who wrote your scholarship letter, he's still in here somewhere, and I'm going to work every day to make sure he's the one who shows up from now on. 6 months later, Richard kept his word. He had been volunteering at Lily's diner every Saturday morning, learning to appreciate the simple dignity of honest work. He had visited dozens of scholarship recipients, hearing their stories and understanding their struggles in ways he never had before. Jessica had completed her nursing degree with honors, and her brother Danny was thriving in his special programs. When Richard walked into the diner that Saturday morning, Jessica greeted him with a genuine smile. She was wearing her nursing school graduation pin alongside the foundation charm on her wrist. The other customers, many of whom had become friends over the months, welcomed him warmly. Betty handed him an apron with Richard embroidered on it, a gift from the regular customers. Table 6 needs coffee, she said with a grin, and try not to spill it on anyone. As Richard tied the apron around his waist and picked up the coffee pot, he caught his reflection in the window. He looked different somehow, not just older but more at peace. The angry, bitter man who had walked into this diner 6 months ago was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true success wasn't measured in dollars or deals, but in the lives you touched and the people you lifted up along the way. He had finally become the man his father always knew he could be, and more importantly, the man Jessica's scholarship letter had shown him he already was deep inside.